Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our class for CMN 201 for Wednesday, October 14th, where I left off was having you watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers last class. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, as well as prepare us for our next movie, which is Psycho, an incredibly iconic film in the horror tradition, and also talk a little bit more about final projects and some of the conventions of writing papers. So, Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956, I think, is very much an illustration of some of the anxieties and concerns of the 1950s, much like I've been suggesting that was the same for the 1930s and the 1940s, and I think we'll see that throughout the course of this semester as well. The Thing came out in 1951, and with the series of readings that I've given you, they identify that as perhaps the film that's most iconic of the 1950s, illustrating the uncertainties of the future rather than the legacies of the past, where the horror films that we've seen thus far have oftentimes been about how the past has come back to haunt the present. And now we see a shift where it seems like the future might be coming to haunt the present. Um, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, though, I think is a more iconic film than The Thing. I think it has more complexity to it, which is why I had assigned it. It's based on a Jack Finney science fiction novel called The Body Snatchers. And as I believe we discussed in the beginning of the semester, genres can oftentimes blend into one another. So horror can blend into science fiction and even fantasy on some levels. And I thought one of the definitions given in the set of readings that I had given us was quite interesting, classifying horror as the dread of knowing, while science fiction was classified as the danger of a closed mind. And I'll let you decide for yourself if you think that is an accurate assessment, especially for something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. What's also interesting about this film is I think it's the beginning of the apocalyptic narrative. I don't think it's done better than when we get to the 1960s and we get to Night of the Living Dead. But now we're beginning to examine questions about globally what could lead to the ending of civilization as we know it. And I think all of these films are cautionary tales for us to look at what's happening around us. In fact, the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers takes place in Santa Mira, California, and mira in Spanish means to look. And I think that's exactly what this film is asking us to do. I don't know if you noticed also that very iconic scene on the town common where the pods are being delivered towards the ending of the film when Becky and Miles are looking out the window, but on the pavement or actually on the road, the word stop is stenciled several times. Again, the idea that we have to do something to stop what's happening within society. That if we fall asleep, which is exactly what happens to the characters in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, that they transform when they fall asleep. But the idea of not necessarily literally falling asleep, but just not paying attention to what's going on in the world around you, not looking, so to speak. And we saw this with Cesar as well in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where it's oftentimes read that Caligari is a representation of this German authoritarian government trying to control the masses as represented by the sleepwalking Cesar, suggesting that the masses themselves are easily controlled because they aren't awake, because they aren't looking. So the 1950s, a time of great anxiety, even though we weren't necessarily in the midst of a world war, but the threat of another world war, or World War III, particularly with an atom bomb that could lead to the destruction of all of civilization on the planet. The early Cold War, some of the tensions between the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States, and communism as opposed to democracy. And those are usually the political ways that the film happens to be read. Definitely there's this idea of a fear of invasion, whether it happened to be from space aliens. And actually in 1948, there was a newspaper article that a flying saucer had crashed in Roswell, New Mexico. And that was what began some of the hysteria about space aliens. But you can also think of that as a metaphor as well for immigration and aliens invading the American way of life. So, if you think about the 1950s, it was a time of suburban flight where many individuals were leaving the cities, especially those who had a certain level of affluence and privilege, and they were going to the suburbs as a place for safety and refuge, or some suggested a prison, being trapped in suburbia. And that said, the car and the motor vehicle was one of the reasons why there was this possibility. And we'll talk more about cars and the idea of transportation when we get to Psycho. But that no place is safe, even seemingly safe suburbia. Um, and it was also the time of the advent of television, which has oftentimes been called an electronic hearth because basically the lights of a television flicker, much like the lights of a campfire might flicker. There's even been some Jungian arguments that this is archetypical of our need to watch television. It goes all the way back to our need to watch campfire, that this is embedded within our genes, if you will. But nevertheless, some of the fears associated with television, that it would turn us into sort of like these mindless zombies, if you will, or I don't know, pod people, if you want to think about it that way, that rather than experience emotions ourselves, what we were doing was living vicariously through the television characters and experiencing emotions that way. So you can see how some of the elements of the 1950s could be reflected in that particular film. Just the idea of pods and how the other, if you want to see it as alien, or the communist threat, planting seeds, if you will, against personal liberty, individuality, a dehumanization that's going on within this story. The original ending was much more pessimistic than the ending than we're given. In the original ending, it ends with Miles running in the highway saying they're coming to get us. And we don't get the authorities who come to the realization that Miles is telling the truth, that he's a man of science and that he can be believed. He's not hysterical, which is how he's initially dismissed by the authorities. And that ending can be kind of problematic if we wanted to read the film as a celebration of individuality, because the ending is also suggesting that we need to rely on authoritarian structures in order to maintain our individuality. That said, I think one of the more interesting things about the film is the idea of the doppelganger that we've seen in other films as well, or this doubling, that we can all have this emotionless double, if you will, and that the monstrosity now does not have to come from the exterior. The monstrosity can be a family member, a friend. The monstrosity can even be ourselves if we allow ourselves to be transformed. And the sense of the uncanny, which we've talked about previously with Freud, that which is familiar and yet unfamiliar at the same time, which is the premise at the beginning of the film, that these characters that have been supposedly transformed into pod people look and act the same way, and yet there isn't something that's quite right about them. It has something to do with the lack of emotion. I think that one of the early lines, that the assumption that mass hysteria is occurring caused by the worry of what is going on in the world, serves as a very nice metaphor for what the film could be suggesting. That said, of course, we find out that Miles was not hysterical, nor were any of the women previously. You notice that initially they were the ones who realized something was wrong. I guess you could state whether or not that's a commentary on a female's ability to embrace and understand emotion. That said, they're dismissed. And I know that a couple of you had mentioned in your attendance questions that you thought that the gender dynamics of this film were particularly interesting. I do as well. And as well, the relationship dynamics. Both Miles Bennell and Becky Driscoll are divorced, which would be somewhat unusual for the time period, especially for the female. And Becky, I think, very much represents some of the tensions with gender roles that we were beginning to discuss with something like Cat People. Again, you had women who were entering into the workforce, and you had women who had the ability to vote and who were exerting their independence and perhaps even their sexuality. And you had the idea of the 1950s, where the woman was supposed to be basically subservient to the home, and became in many ways a kind of Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy prisoner of the home. And you've got that with the contrast of a Becky Driscoll who's not only divorced, but her wardrobe at the very beginning, where she's wearing that strapless dress, is very much supposed to evoke the erotic. And there is some sexual bantering going on between Becky and Miles. So, in some ways, it can raise some eyebrows in relation to some of the expectations of the time period. That said, it's the kiss that tells Miles that this is no longer Becky, and that's as far as consummating their relationship as they happen to go, is a kiss. And of course, Cat People is entirely about consummation. But this sense of this film as being either an allegory for communism invading the American way of life and removing our individuality, or McCarthyism. If you've heard about some of the hysteria in the United States at that time period with Senator McCarthy, basically trying to identify communists in the government and the media and in film. And more often than not, it was just a witch hunt more than anything else. But there was a good amount of post-war paranoia because of both of those things. And definitely paranoia is an element in this film, as well as the idea of the loss of humanity and the loss of individuality. And maybe it is because of what is going on in the world. And that this world is a very different place and a much less safe place than it was previously because of all of the political and social tensions going on within the world. That said, I think that one of the reasons why this film tends to capture people's imaginations is because they can understand the perhaps concerns of how we as humanity might be losing our humanity. And it's a concern that we could even have perhaps in our present day. But that said, I think that as good as the thing is, and it is a great film, I think Invasion of the Body Snatchers provides more for us to analyze. And as I had asked you in your attendance question, to try to identify a moral, and there are multiple morals that can be identified in this particular film. It is deliberately complex and ambiguous. But one of you made a comment about how Miles at the end is pleading desperately for help and he's ignored. And what does that say about our humanity or lack of humanity when you have someone on a highway obviously in distress and everyone continues to drive by? So there's some food for thought, or perhaps I've planted a seed, pun intended, for you to consider about the film. But I wanted to move ahead a little bit. Not that I'm completely done with Invasion of the Body Snatchers. We can revisit that a little bit next class. And talk about your final project as we are approaching the mid part of the semester, believe it or not. And you've got up until the ending of the semester in order to submit in your final project, but the sooner the better. And that you've got a lot of freedom on how to go about putting that together. For those of you who are considering doing your typical academic paper, I would think something in the area of about 4 pages or so, but as long or as short as it needs to be. And you may have noted that there was a prerequisite for this class, English 101. So my hope is that, or what we call English Composition 1 at GCC. So my hope is that you would have already reviewed the conventions of writing a paper, but you'll see that what I did was I attached a handout about how to write a paper. In fact, it was a handout that was given to me when I was an undergraduate many years ago. And you can see that it's divided up into 3 elements. And this is in the syllabus and other documents folder. I put this handout. That basically there's the planning stage, there's the writing stage, and there's the editing stage. And I can tell you that most students skip the planning stage, go straight to the writing stage, run out of time, and they never have the editing. So I encourage you to begin now thinking about the planning, ideas that you could be pursuing. Don't worry about language or writing the perfect first sentence. Don't even necessarily worry about a thesis. Just come up with some topics or ideas that you might want to pursue. If you do a little bit each day, it's going to be a much more manageable assignment than if you try to do it all at the very ending. And then once you've done some planning, then you can begin to do some rough writing, knowing that you can always revise and polish it. Or as I had a very wise professor once tell me, a piece of writing is never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. And I think that's very true. You can continue to revise and refine your sentences, but you do as much as you can with the time that you have. And making sure that you leave enough time at the end to edit so that you can proofread and that you can review. So just some general comments about writing. You will have an introductory paragraph, and that usually indicates your thesis, which happens to be the main point of your writing. And you may not know when you first begin what your thesis is. You may actually discover it over the process of the writing experience. That's the learning piece that goes on. So you can actually discover the thesis after the fact and then just plug it in into the opening paragraph. So you don't necessarily have to write the paper completely in chronological order. This is also where if you are going to be referencing other texts or authors, you can talk about them briefly in the introduction. If you're doing a literary analysis, which you aren't, then you would give the name of the author of, let's say, the short story and the name of the short story. You may be doing a film analysis. So in this instance, you may be giving the name of the director and the film and the opening paragraph so that we know what film you are referencing if it just so turns out that you happen to be analyzing a particular film. Now, if you wanted to, you could write a purely critical paper, which means that you rely on your own thoughts and your own interpretations based on the reading you've done for class and the discussions you've heard about class and the responses your classmates have given. And that's perfectly fine. Or you can elect to do a research paper, which means that you are beginning to look up information from outside sources about your particular topic. Now, a research paper is usually more complex than a critical paper because not only do you have to put together the arguments that other individuals have made, but you have to come up with your own argument as well. And the way this works is that if you're writing a research paper, you should have a works cited page at the very ending of your paper that lists all of the works that you've quoted or cited by author's last name in alphabetical order so that one could find those particular quotes. That said, it'll depend on what your preference is. If you're writing a research paper, you are definitely going to have to include a works cited page with all of the references you've used. If you wanted to do something like an interpretation of a film, let's say you wanted to interpret, let's say, Night of the Living Dead, and your own academic analysis without using outside sources, it would suffice just to give the name of the film and the director in the opening paragraph. And you can elect to either include a works cited page, which would cite that film, or you can elect just to omit the works cited page since you've already cited the film in your introduction. All of this is related to the MLA system of parenthetical documentation. MLA related to Modern Language Association, which is the system for quoting and documenting that you use in the languages in the humanities, and that would include our communication class as well. And basically, it's a system where after using a direct quotation, you indicate a page number within a set of parentheses. Or if you're using a website, it could be the author or the name of the website. And that's all within those parentheses. You don't have to give lots of information about place of publication or publisher or anything like that. You give the least amount of information necessary so that someone can read the quote and read what's enclosed within the parentheses and have a sense of where that quote comes from. And then that person would turn to your works cited page at the ending of your paper and be able to find all of the detailed information about that particular quote. So that said, your job is basically to provide evidence to support your particular position. That could be through quotation, but it could also be through paraphrase, and it could also be through your own observations as well. Those are the body paragraphs of your paper. Note that all of your paragraphs should be 3 or more sentences. Anything less than 3 sentences is really not considered to be a paragraph in an academic paper. The first sentence of that paragraph being a topic sentence, which summarizes almost always what the paragraph is about. So what you should be able to do, as that handout indicates, is read the first sentences of your paper and have some sort of a skeletal outline of the main points. So after you've written your body paragraphs with your arguments and your evidence and your details and any quotation if necessary, then you have a concluding paragraph. And that's the last paragraph that gives a sense of closure. It doesn't add any new argumentation, but it basically puts an ending to what it is you've been arguing. And then if you think about how you go about structuring that particular paper, what you should have is a position that reasonable people could disagree about. So you're not just stating a fact, but that you've provided enough evidence so that your position is a possibility. It doesn't even have to be a probability, just a possibility. And if paragraphs are 3 or more sentences, if you think about what a sentence is, it's a group of words that expresses a complete idea. So basically, what you've got in a sentence is a verb, an action, a subject, who or what performs that action, and it expresses a complete thought. So you should be able to read that sentence and not have to rely on any of the previous or following sentences for that sentence to make sense. And then we utilize things like punctuation to help clarify meaning in our sentences. Punctuation oftentimes helps give the reader a sense of what a word would sound like or a statement would sound like if we were delivering it orally. Think about ending punctuation, and there is a difference between a period and an exclamation point and a question mark. So if I were to take a simple declarative statement such as sit down, when I say sit down, and you can tell by the way that I've changed my voice that that's a question, but you wouldn't know that through reading, so I would need to use a question mark. If I say sit down, well, then that's the exclamation point. And if I say sit down, that's the period. And commas are merely pauses, places where you would normally take a small breath or where you would want to emphasize something. And again, all of this I'm hoping is review, but I did want to leave you with 2 resources that might be of some use to you. In terms of documentation for the MLA parenthetical system, Purdue OWL, if you've ever heard of it, it happens to be a website done through Purdue University. And actually, it doesn't just talk about documentation, it talks about the entire writing process. So that if you need a review about sentences or paragraphs or anything of that nature, you can do that. But I know that oftentimes it's the documentation piece that individuals get anxious about. So if that happens to be the case, I've included the link for Purdue OWL. You don't need to be a student at Purdue in order to access this. And our own GCC library as well has a section that's devoted just to citation guides, and I've included that too. So for those of you who already knew all of this and you were a bit bored, I apologize. For those of you who didn't know this and I went rather fast, I'm sorry, and feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to fill in gaps. And I hope that for most of you, it was just the right speed in terms of reviewing some of the elements of writing. But again, I'm certainly here to assist in whatever way I can, and I'm very happy to look at drafts as well. And keep in mind that if you can get in your final project early enough before the ending of the semester, I can evaluate it, return it back to you, and you could have the option of rewriting it for a higher grade if you so elected to do so. So I thought what I would do is leave you with the film Psycho and a question about Psycho. And then next class, we could put some closing comments on Invasion of the Body Snatchers and just continue on with the very iconic Psycho. And the attendance question is, why do you think the shower scene in Psycho is so iconic? Now, if you've never seen Psycho before, you may not have an idea what the shower scene is. But the thing is that the shower scene oftentimes is known, even though the film itself is not. So if you don't know what the shower scene is, I will tell you right now, where we have a character who's taking a shower, and let's just say a terrible thing happens to her when she is in the shower. And that's known as the shower scene. And you'll know it when you see it. And again, I hope I haven't given away too many spoilers for those of you who have not seen the film. But I can tell you right now that anybody who talks about Psycho talks about this particular scene. And in fact, it was so disturbing that my own mother-in-law, after she saw that particular film and that particular scene in the movies with her husband, my father-in-law, refused to take a shower by herself for weeks afterwards unless he was standing outside of the bathroom door. And there were many people who responded in a similar way. So That said, there was something about this film that was very visceral. And Alfred Hitchcock, who's a master, and we'll talk a little bit more about him next class, really knew how to build suspense. So much so that the way that he sold this film was that movie theaters were not allowing individuals entrance into the film after the film had started. And again, that just helped to bring up the hype. And in fact, this was a time period, the 1960s, where there were lots of gimmicks that were being used to sell films that we will talk about next class in relation to Psycho. But I thought I would just end it here and let you watch Psycho, and then we could talk a little bit about, in our attendance question, the shower scene, and then we can continue on next class. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and enjoy Psycho. Take care. Bye bye.